So I wanted to welcome you all to hear our second guest lecture of the academic year, Dr. Ian McKay, who's going to deliver a lecture entitled Vimy Traps, Canadians and the Contested Memory of World War I. And just before we introduce Dr. McKay, I'd like to thank all those people whose work has made the lecture series possible. The committee members, besides myself, Jeff Bull, Melanie Chaparian, Angela Aujala, and Chandra Hodgson. Humber's media service technicians who make everything work properly, you know, in the manner we've just illustrated. The president's executive assistant, Deborah Green, and of course, Humber's president, Chris Whitaker, without whose support the series would not be possible. And I'm delighted to say he's here with us today, so thank you, sir. So I just wanted to take a moment to highlight this semester's lineup of speakers. We kicked things off on October the 6th with journalist and author Carolyn Abraham, who delivered a very interesting talk entitled "Every Genome Tells a Story. Do You Want to Know Yours?" That was here in the 7th semester. And our final speaker for the fall is a graduate of Yale Law School, York University, and our own General Arts and Sciences program here at Humber. His name is Jamil Javani. And he's definitely kept himself busy since returning from Yale to Canada. He's been working as an articling student at the law firm Torys. He's also on the board of directors for the Children's Aid Society. And he gained some media attention recently for work that he has done for a group that he founded. It's actually, it's called the Policing Literacy Initiative, and it's a kind of a grassroots think tank and advocacy group. It's very youth-driven, and it focuses on policing issues that are based here in Toronto. So that's what he'll be talking to us about, and that one is going to be at the Lakeshore campus. His talk is entitled "Bridging the Divide Between Police and Community." So that'll be in the community room at the Lakeshore campus. So information about the talks we feature each semester can be found on our homepage, and you'll also find an archive of our past speakers there too. So our first speaker, Carolyn Abraham, is there, available for viewing now. We also advertise our talks in the Humber Communique, on Humber TV, HSF bulletin boards, the event pages of Facebook, Google+, we even tweet. So you can find out about us through all those means. And I'd just like to take the opportunity to welcome everyone watching via the live stream at the Lakeshore and Orangeville campuses, and just to extend a special welcome to students in attendance today from Nicolette Kadiri's War and Terrorism class. Welcome to you, as well as my own students studying contemporary moral issues in the General Arts and Sciences program. Welcome to you. They're louder than the first group. Heard at least one whoop. So this would be that point where I remind you to silence all those cell phones. And as you listen to the lecture, don't forget to jot down questions. We will have time for a Q&A session at the end. We will have a microphone available, probably this one, or probably a different one. It's over here. Oh, it's up back there. So just to the side of where everyone is, and we'll just ask you to use that microphone for questions, otherwise they won't be heard on the live stream, so please do that. And if you need the microphone brought to you, we can certainly do that as well. We're going to have a little reception to follow with refreshments, so if you can stick around for that, that would be great. And I would like to just now turn the floor over to Daniel Caudle, who is a student in the journalism program, who is going to introduce today's speaker. Daniel.
Hey everyone, thanks for coming. Dr. Ian McKay has taught Canadian history at Queen's University since 1988. His research interests lie in Canadian cultural history, particularly the history of Canada as a liberal order, Canadian and international left-wing movements, and the economic and social history of Atlantic Canada in the 19th and 20th centuries, especially as this relates to the working class movements and to tourism. Dr. McKay has received numerous awards and distinctions, including becoming an elected Fellow of the Royal Society of Canada in 2014. His book, In the Province of History, received the Pierre Savard Award for Best Book in English or French by the International Council of Canadian Studies. And his book, Reasoning Otherwise, won the Canadian Historical Association's Sir John A. Macdonald Prize for Best Canadian History Book. His most recent book, Warrior Nation, Rebranding Canada in an Age of Anxiety, documents a transformation in post-war Canada's central myth symbols. From a peaceable and just society of multicultural tolerance to one that is increasingly militarized, authoritarianism, and politically polarized. We are very happy to have him participate in our series today. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Ian McKay.
Well, my sincere thanks to Ian, Gary, and Humber College for inviting me to speak to you today as part of the President's Lecture Series. Under the able leadership of Professor Daniel Hambley, last year your college hosted a remarkable conference on representing World War I, Perspectives at the Centenary, which drew scholars from across Canada and around the world to debate issues that are raised by the Great War of 1914-1918, also aka known as the First World War. So some of us call it the Great War because we kind of read a lot of English stuff, and other people call it the First World War. 1914-1918 also works as a name, but you know what I mean. It's the First World War, often called the Great War. Today I want to continue this process of reflection on the war and take forward some of the themes I raised in my talk at Humber College's conference last year. And I call my talk Vimy Traps, Canadians and the Contested Memory of World War I. My theme is, in a nutshell, that Canadians have always disagreed about this war. That there never has been, and perhaps never will be, consensus about this war. From 1914 on, many Canadians, especially linked to the federal state, attempted with great energy and zeal to convince Canadians that A, this was a good war, and B, that their own state had been spotless, excellent organizers of this war. But also from 1914, those who opposed this war on moral, political, and practical grounds have never been in a small minority. So we are essentially insisting that this war is and remains a contested terrain. So we hope to undermine what I would call the first trap, or a kind of conceptual limitation. And that is to imagine this war as kind of the birth of the nation, imagining Canada to be an organically unified, cohesive entity of the sort that you would think a person is. So Canada was born and reaches maturity just like a person is born and reaches maturity. And we further assume, if we use these metaphors, that Canada is should have a unified conception of something as big as the First World War. I think such organic imagery of Canada as one big cohesive entity tends to undermine coherent investigation into the real worlds of Canadians, and it also undermines creative thinking about peace and war in the 20th century. So my central point today, the takeaway point, is that the Great War never was and should not become the rallying point for an official nationalism in search of the birth of the nation. Rather, it should offer us an opportunity to reflect more critically and in an evidence-based manner upon the legacies of military conflict in the 20th century. Going to the painting, many of us probably know of Frederick Varley as a member of the Group of Seven, the artist who attained fame as Canada's most famous painters of landscape. So if you go to a bank building anywhere in Canada, you'll see somewhere on the wall probably a Group of Seven landscape. Yet he also deserves fame as a war artist, who in this capacity visited the battlefields of France and Flanders in 1918. So this painting is called For What? And he's depicting a Canadian gravedigger, a soldier, as he takes a break from the gruesome tasks of burying his comrades, So we see a brooding sky divided against itself. We see muddy ground red with blood. We see a cart laden with corpses. And the corpses themselves are indistinct and collectivized in death. So it's kind of hard when you look at the corpses in the cart to tell which body is whose. In some ways, you could say this is kind of an upside-down pastoral world, where you do see a farmer in a landscape, which we would expect in a pastoral landscape, but this farmer is not planting new life, but actually dead bodies. Varley sought to express how disturbing he found this landscape of the war in a letter to his wife, and he wrote, "We'd be healthier to forget the war, and that we never can." And then he continues, "We are forever tainted with its abortiveness and its cruel drama." Tainted fields, abortiveness, cruelty. Varley is struggling with these words to convey the weird way in which the war had transformed nature itself, much in the same vein as Frank Underhill, who used the expression that almost got him fired as a history professor from the University of Toronto. He said that Canadians were no longer interested in sending their boys over to fertilize the fields of Flanders and France. So you can see in both those moments, people are trying to grasp something that's almost ungraspable, the scope, the enormity, and the horror of this war. Today, if you want to see the painting up front in the real thing, you can go to the Canadian War Museum in Ottawa. It's been placed in a poorly lit corner, and it comes with this fascinatingly argumentative caption, and I quote, "What do you think that Frederick Varley is suggesting with this evocative work and title? Was the war pointless? If the war had been pointless, why had more than 400,000 Canadians continued to serve and fight overseas?" It's rather unusual for a museum to take issue with the display of its own treasure on the wall. It's very unusual for a Canadian museum to take umbrage at a display from one of the group of 7, our sacred landscape painters. But I think in the War Museum's evident discomfort about this painting and about Varley's question, for what? In its discomfort, you're seeing a telling indication of the extent to which this question, for what, remains a burning one today. We aren't comfortable with it. Our official War Museum all but declares that Varley should have never asked this question at all. But if you look at how Canadians en masse handled this war, especially in the 1920s and 1930s, when it was a very fresh memory, you will find them asking Varley's question over and over and over again. For what? What did these mass deaths really accomplish? In Vimy Traps, which we're releasing next year, Jamie Swift and I, we're going to explore how this question played itself out from 1918 to our own time. And what we have found is that across a vast spectrum of opinion, left, right, and center, there was an obsession with Varley's question. There was a growing conviction across this spectrum that the best answer to the question, for what, was something like this: so that humanity may turn its back forever on war. There was a drastic shift in Canadian opinion in the 1920s and 1930s against militarism and for peace. Some of the Protestant ministers who had made a name for themselves in 1914, 1918 by turning their churches into veritable recruiting halls for the war spent the 1920s repenting for what they had done. They termed their militarism the work of the devil. The peace movement in Canada attained massive proportions. No fewer than 480,000 Canadians signed a peace petition in 1932 out of a population of 11 million people. Even monuments to the dead of the war, especially the Vimy Monument in France, which has since become an icon of the entire country, were as much monuments to peace as to war. As you can see in this 1936 stamp with the famous monument in the background, one prominent peace group felt that the Vimy monument was the perfect illustration to use to convey its message of peace to the world. And when the monument was unveiled in 1936, instead of military parades and artillery salutes, what you found were such things as Lloydstone's internationally recognized peace hymn, which was sort of the give peace a chance of the Depression era. Jeffrey O'Hara's rather more combative poem called Guns was also read out, part of this poem reads like this: "Let thy hand reach from shore to shore, O God of love forevermore. Crush out the hated curse of war, the guns, guns, guns." This was the overwhelmingly predominant theme at the unveiling of the Vimy Memorial. No more war. Prime Minister Mackenzie King, a self-declared member of the peace movement, advised the crowd in his speech that Canada demanded that the nations of Europe serve to obliterate war forever. "Obliterate all that makes for war and death," he wrote. Canada appeals to these countries to unite in an effort to bring into being a world at peace. If you look at the allegorical figures at Vimy, at the monument, you will find Canada bereft, a great big statue of Mother, sometimes called Mother Canada. You will not find a statue of Canada victorious. You will find no depictions of Canadians vanquishing the Hun, but a broken sword signifying the urgency of peace. Perhaps our most startling discovery through all of this has been how many returned soldiers and their families shared this sentiment. This was not a sentiment of a few isolated peaceniks. This was a sentiment of vast numbers of soldiers. We find, in fact, that returned soldiers were very often the First World War's fiercest critics. In 1934, the Toronto Star and the Manitoba Free Press ran a series on the First World War, a pictorial series that aimed to really bring Canadians the visual truth about the war. Yeah, okay. Sure, no problem. How's that? Better? To bring Canadians the visual truth about the war. And this was an extremely provocative thing to do. Consider that these photographs showed bodies of dead and mutilated soldiers, and the people could recognize the bodies in the pictures. Consider that this was at a time when everybody had, in Canada, would have known people down the road, if not in their immediate families, who had lost people in this war. Consider that you had had just so much sorrow and grief bound up in this war, and people were still in the process of bereavement. So here you have the Toronto Star running this series in 1934, and some of the titles are like Roasted Men, Boiled Men, Tortured Men, War, and what is the net result of war save death and ruin? Now the captions were written by a much-loved Toronto Star columnist, great Canadian humorist and sports writer named Gregory Clark, who was also a decorated veteran from Vimy Ridge. And Gregory Clark didn't hit quite as hard on this theme, a bit more understated, and yet all the way through Gregory Clark's captions, there's a kind of cynicism about the war. Gregory Clark commenting on a shot of an excited crowd outside Buckingham Palace on the night of the declaration of war, he writes, "Whatever our honest and noble intentions that night, if any eye in this throng could have foreseen 4 years ahead, with a roll of 1 million British dead, could we have cheered as we did then? Now we know that a declaration of war is the occasion of national mourning." Remember, this is from one of Canada's most beloved writers who had a huge reputation in Toronto, became a member of the Order of Canada in the 60s. One of the most gripping photographs in this series was this one, which was given the title Canadian and German Boys at War. And Gregory Clark writes of this photograph from 1918. He says, In 1918, down the tree-lined roads out of Cambrai, come the hordes of youth of Germany to look with wonder at the youthful faces of their conquerors. This remarkable photograph is surely one of the bitterest arguments against war ever advanced. And what really got them was the expression on the face of this German boy. Just seemed to sort of convey something of the enormity of kids in the war and the startling new realities that the war had entailed for him. Well, how did people react to this explosive series? After reading the historians and how the war was supposedly remembered, we would have expected an outraged response and the tarring and feathering of the unpatriotic journalists. But with very few exceptions, exactly the opposite is the case. Over 100 letters pour into the newspapers, some from veterans giving their military numbers so that their bona fides can be checked. They were overwhelmingly positive about the series. Entire branches of the Canadian Legion wrote in to congratulate the newspapers for running such candid photographs of the war. For William Howe of Owen Sound, the sights of desolation, carnage, and suffering brought tears to his eyes. At last, he wrote, the Canadian people would begin to realize better than ever before the utter madness and hellishness of modern war. If only every country would publish its war pictures, the false glamour of Mars, the god of war, would soon fade out forever. J. Morris of the 10th Battalion, and he gives this number 417223 in case you want to check him up. J. Morris writes, I do hope that if another war should come our way, our youths will say, no war for us. Our fathers suffered quite enough in the last war. Another letter writer from Peterborough writes, and it's interesting that he echoes the very title of Varley's painting. He writes, no pen can do more than intimate the mental agony, the torture, and physical wretchedness endured. And then he asks, for what? Over and over again, the correspondents, many of them veterans, use the very word that has become forbidden in fashionable discussions of the Great War, futile. And this word futile comes up again and again in the writings of the men who fought in the war. So for many, many interwar Canadians, including veterans, the answer to Varley's question, for what, was something like, so that humanity would realize that war under conditions of mechanized modernity is a horror show that should never be repeated. One of the great merits of Tim Cook's 2-volume Canadians Fighting the Great War, an invaluable resource from which I have drawn many of the empirical examples in this lecture and which I would recommend to all of you. Cook says that really explores the number of times that Canadians actually fighting the war, despite the military censorship that they were under, and despite the fact that they were right in the middle of this situation, they wrote the most cynical, acerbic appraisals of this war. Many of them started to say, 9 out of 10 of the soldiers that I know fighting, and this is from 1918, would back any realistic peace proposal. Or we could turn to Will R. Bird, who's sometimes considered Canada's archetypal war novelist, the go-to guy for the Canadian War for many people. Sometimes Bird is represented as kind of gung-ho on the war, but this is actually a complete misrepresentation. Only the sky above you seems fit and clean, Bird remarked about the battlefield of Ypres. It is a place of horror, tortured with sinister gullies and gulches, upheaved, blasted, disemboweled, an unsightliness few tourists can bear to see. Or talking about the Battle of Passchendaele with an admiring Briton while Bird was on leave. Bird was told by the Briton that as a soldier in the famous Battle of Passchendaele, he should be really proud, pumped up to have been part of this world historic battle. He had lived a great day, said the Briton to him. I don't think so, was Bird's reply. And then he adds, in a most striking departure from today's common sense about the First World War, Bird adds, this war is Wrong. So you see, I think there's a simple-mindedness to the caption the Canadian War Museum has attached to Varley's painting. For as in Bird's case, persistence in the war did not necessarily mean a positive endorsement of the war. In fact, in the company of a legion of other Canadians, Bird came to regard the war as an almost unthinkable calamity, which is in fact the overall consensus of opinion in Europe. What's rather astonishing, given how often and uniformly we've been told that interwar Canadians were convinced of the sanctity of this war, what's rather astonishing is how seldom any of them say anything about this war as the birth of a nation. This theme is almost entirely absent in the interwar period. So almost none of them, in response to Varley's question, for what, will say, well, to give birth to Canada. Even in 1927, when the country was taken up with celebrating the Diamond Jubilee of Confederation, when the Peace Tower was opened in Parliament Hill, and when only cave dwellers could have not noticed the extraordinary wave of nationalism sweeping the country, even in 1927, you'll find very, very few people invoking any memory of Vimy. Startling. The idea that Canada fought a great war of independence in 1914, 1918, and that the country was born at Vimy Ridge is not easily located in the 1920s and the 1930s, and not easily found by the very people who fought in the war. Contrast this picture of pervasive interwar skepticism about the war with today's martial nationalism. Now, Vimy Ridge, birth of the nation, is a massively promoted slogan. You can buy the ball cap and you can buy the t-shirt. The Great War has been cleaned up and made presentable for the general public. No more Varley-esque questioning. In fact, no more questioning, period. Take, for example, this 2010 edition of Discover Canada, the country's guide to intending Canadian citizens. It presents us with a First World War, highlighting the images of valiant men on horseback, as you can see in the top left. It presents us with a flattering portrait of Sir Arthur Currie, and he is presented to us as, quote, Canada's greatest soldier. The Citizenship Guide unequivocally declares, the war strengthened both national and imperial pride, particularly in English Canada. The guide contains no images of death and destruction. Even the word trench fails to make an appearance. It was Canada from Atlantic to the Pacific on parade. In those few minutes, I witnessed the birth of a nation. One man is quoted in the Citizenship Guide about Vimy Ridge. Typically, this nationalist insight has arrived many decades after the event itself. We are back to Queen Victoria's British Empire, with valiant heroes proving their martial excellence on the field of battle. And below them, as if to make the romance of war complete, is a female nurse with downcast eyes, ready to attend to the battle wounds of men. In sharp disagreement with the views of many Canadians of the 1920s and 1930s, including many of the soldiers who actually fought in it, we are now urged to remember this war as a time of wholesome, undivided national purpose, gallant leadership, and heroic achievement. A time when, and I quote from the current Veterans Canada website, Canada truly achieved nation status. Take that, Fred Varley. Placing his considerable authority behind this argument that Canada was born at Vimy Ridge, and let's call that argument Vimyism for short, we find Don Cherry, who on Coach's Corner on the 5th of April 2014 provided an invaluable distillation of the key themes of the argument. As Cherry put it, and I quote, April 9th, boy, this is when Canada became a nation, birth of a nation. The French and the British tried to take it for a whole year, and General Currie said, no Brits, no French involved. I'm a Canadian general. We will take it in 2 days. We are the best. For a more academic version of Vimyism, you might turn to the writings of Professor Jonathan Vance, since the 1990s one of Canada's preeminent writers on the Great War. According to Vance, the First World War brought Canada a new sense of nationhood as its citizen army, fighting for, and I quote, democracy, freedom, justice, and Christianity, carried Canada's colors, resisting an atrocity-perpetrating enemy, and thus inspired an entire people. These soldiers willing to defend, and I quote again, Canada, Western civilization, and Christianity became, and I quote, in a very real sense, the nation in arms, the life force of Canada transported overseas. And at Vimy Ridge, Vance continues, the Canadian Corps, quote, stunning success, a triumph of organization, preparation, training, and raw courage, constituted nothing less than, here we go again, the birth of a nation. The Great War thus constituted the crucible of Canadian nationhood, and upon it has risen Canada's myth, the great narrative of sacrifice for freedom in which all full-blooded Canadians are expected to believe. For the victory of the Allies in the Great War constituted in Vance's mind, quote, a victory over the forces of barbarism. Canadians who really get Canada, the myth of Canada, understand this basic truth. Take that, once again, Fred Varley, obviously not up to stuff as a Canadian, whatever your status as a Group of Seven painter. Vimyism, almost unknown before the 1960s, provides a fascinating example of the uses of history. Certainly in the 1920s and 1930s, you can find some examples that sort of edge on the verge of Vimy, birth of the nation. Mackenzie King, Prime Minister, clearly senses that maybe his conservative enemies are cooking up something a little bit like that. They taunt him relentlessly about not having served in the war, say he's yellow-bellied and he's, a coward and not a real Canadian. In 1926, he's even posed in a major election against Governor General Byng, who was the hero of Vimy Ridge. If you bought the line, you will say, well, there was no contest. You've got a guy that didn't find the time to serve in the war versus Governor General Byng, victor of Vimy Ridge. Surprise, surprise, who wins the 1926 election? Mackenzie King, and in an election in which he was repeatedly baited for not having done his bit in the war. The Diamond Jubilee of 1927 does feature a few voices saying, gee, the war was a formative moment for Canada. But not many, and not many unambivalently positive ones. At Vimy in 1936, the crowd certainly did hear words, especially from King Edward VIII, for instance, congratulating Canadians on their epochal feat of arms. Yet in all such examples of martial nationalism, we find very rare voices. To a startling extent, down to the 1960s, the claims that Vimy was the birth of the nation and the First World War somehow constituted our war of independence are almost inaudible, even among the veterans whom one might have thought susceptible to the suggestion they were Canada's #1 heroes. But then in the warm nationalistic glow of centennial celebrations, some Canadians began to romanticize the war, which is now placed alongside the fur trade, the building of the CPR, and the founding of the NHL in the great arc of the colony to nation narrative. A significant milestone here was Pierre Berton's Vimy, 1986, in which Canada's most popular historian, his books would sell hundreds of thousands of copies. Everyone would give them to their kids for Christmas. Immensely popular guy. Pierre Berton in 1986 does write a very interesting book about Vimy, full of useful detail. And he concludes that because of Vimy, our country found its manhood. And I think this was kind of an epochal step towards the coming of Vimy into the mainstream of Canadian nationalism. So now the answer to Varley's question, for what, was emphatically so that Canada might be born. But to be fair to Berton, he immediately added after saying that, was it worth it? The answer, of course, is no. having contemplated all the horrors of the actual battle, Burton himself said this price was not worth it. The immense irony of Vimyism today is that we have retained Burton's fevered evocation of national pride, but we have lost his anguished questions about its supposed price tag. It's very much like the cult of Gallipoli in Australia. Very much resembles the Anzac myth that the Australians and New Zealanders have developed about their own military. And like the Gallipoli myth, it really takes flight in the 1990s. As in Australia, some historians and many conservative politicians got fed up with feminists, gays and lesbians, Aboriginal people, and tutti quanti, raising guilt-provoking questions about Canadian history. You don't want Canadian history that's going to make your school kids feel bad and upset about themselves. So rising up against these supposed history killers and against any notion of Canada as a peacekeeping and peaceable kingdom, a powerful cohort of intellectuals, many of them attached to the military, began an extensive rehabilitation of the Great War. They're strongly encouraged to do so by the federal government, by such organizations as the Dominion Institute and the Vimy Foundation. And in the dramatically refurbished Canadian War Museum, opened 2005, in addition to the snide caption about Fred Varley, you'll find the explicitly argued proposition that Canada was molded by war. Although which Big Bang got Canada started seems a matter of some debate. Thanks to Veterans Affairs, harried educationists in search of teaching materials can now access an abundance of war-oriented stuff for children from kindergarten to high school. Those aged from 5 to 11, for instance, are introduced to tales of animals in war. By the time of Vimy's 90th commemoration in 2007 and the new Conservative Citizenship Guide of 2008, veneration for Vimy had become de rigueur. That Canada's Great War had really been a really, really great war had become a pervasively held and proper opinion. Well, stepping back a bit, one might say there are 5 conceptual elements to this Vimyism. First, we find the general theme of the battle's great grandeur, nobility, sublime nobility, and world historic significance. That the Great War is no picnic is emphasized, but the hardships of the Great War were endured by our soldiers who sacrificed themselves for the greater good so that Canada might exist. Second, there is a focus on the heroes who made the nation and even remade the world. If Vimy was the birth of the nation, Canada's soldiers, above all, Canada's greatest soldier, Arthur Currie, were its male midwives. Third, there is the theme of Canadian exceptionalism. The Canadians won at Vimy because, unlike the British and unlike the French, they knew how to get things done. Unencumbered by useless old traditions, unafraid of hardship and death, Canadians brought their can-do spirit to Vimy and prevailed where others had failed. We carried the day, and it is sometimes even implied, turned the tide of the entire war. Fourth, there's the idea that Canadians in arms were united by Vimy as never before. The soldiers were disunited before they came to Vimy, united and disciplined afterwards. For the Canadian troops who fought at Vimy, exclaims one contemporary martial nationalist, it was one of those rare moments of truth. This was the first time those soldiers recognized who they were. They went up the ridge as regionals, and they came down as nationals. Other versions of the saying that they went up the ridge as people from Nova Scotia and Quebec and British Columbia, and they came down as people from Canada. This miraculous transformation in the course of 4 days was then quickly communicated over the ocean to Canada itself, as Canadians en masse thrilled to the victory at Vimy and overcame their long-standing divisions. Thus, the nation emerged as a unified entity, unanimously and rightly impressed by the deeds of its valiant saviors. Fifth, on a meta level, there is the pervasive assumption in Vimyism, which Vance makes explicit, that the Great War was fought for decency, democracy, and freedom, to defend our values against their values, to defend civilization against barbarism, democracy against tyranny. So in response to Varley's question for what, this correct answer would say, so that Canada could be born and attain its stature as a stalwart defender of liberal democratic values against our freedom-hating enemies. In our book, Jamie and I will argue that each of these positions is empirically untenable and that their diffusion threatens to trap Canadians in Victorian forms of militarism unsuitable for a 21st century country. Today, I will give you the condensed version of our argument. First, the official Vimy narratives misleadingly focus on the 4-day run-up to the ridge itself, from April 9th to the 12th, 1917. What's generally neglected in all of this and what misleads you is the overall context of this battle, which is that the Vimy Ridge was part of the wider Battle of Arras, which in turn was designed to be essentially a diversion from a much bigger struggle being waged further to the south. You probably aren't interested, and I don't think I can hold your attention if I go into all the machinations between Lloyd George and the French in Paris and their poster boy, General Robert Nivelle, who was going to solve the whole problem of the stalemate on the Western Front with a grand heroic offensive. Suffice to say, the Vimy Ridge was one part of the Battle of Arras, which in turn was a diversion from this much bigger struggle. Alas for the Entente, i.e. our side, this great gamble did not pay off. The offensive was a dismal failure. So you see, the Canadians of Vimy Ridge are there in 1917 as part of a much bigger political and strategic picture over which they exerted almost no influence. And in a sense, they did not fully understand. We had no powerful person sitting around the decision-making tables when these strategic decisions were made. So the Battle of Arras, of which Vimy Ridge is part, did not constitute the breakthrough for which Lloyd George and company had been praying. Nor indeed does the taking of Vimy Ridge. Once the ridge was taken, the Canadian soldiers are unable to press any further, and the Germans simply reconsolidated their lines further east. So here's the nub. Among many German write-ups of Vimy Ridge, including the official histories of some of the regiments, German regiments that fought at Vimy Ridge is not considered a defeat. Some of them consider it a victory, and sometimes the Germans say, well, it was basically a draw. Germans even struck a medal to recognize the valor and success of their soldiers in withholding a much more numerous enemy. So the suggestion that Vimy Ridge was a decisive victory, let alone a war-deciding one, is wholly misleading. Nothing important was decided about the war in Vimy Ridge in 1917. Even General Arthur Currie, proud of his achievement, conceded that Vimy Ridge had been vastly overrated. It barely makes the footnotes of many general histories, even in ultra-patriotic British chronicles of this war. And Currie himself, to move to the second point, is difficult to turn into a military hero of Napoleonic proportions. Tim Cook aptly likens this former Victoria real estate speculator to the CEO of a company. And he does seem to have possessed a rare administrative capacity. But he was neither loved nor respected by many of his troops. In 1918, as the Germans pushed ahead in their last desperate drive to win the war, Currie issued what he hoped would be an inspiring message for his soldiers. He urged them to stand fast against the Germans, and he wrote, "You will advance or fall where you stand, facing the enemy. To those who will fall, I say, your names will be revered forever and forever by your grateful country, and God will take you unto himself." This was grand, noble rhetoric. his own soldiers thought it comical. Some rudely satirized their leader's messed up syntax. They asked each other, "Do you stand where you fall?" And one of Curry's friends remarked afterwards, "Appeals to the higher ideals only made them ill." A hero to many historians, General Curry was, by 1918, reviled by many, if not most, of his men, who blamed the Corps commander for the losses suffered in the war and now for the delay in getting home. It did not help matters that at a time when his troops were complaining of inadequate rations, he himself had grown quite fat on the better food and staying in royal palaces. I quote from Tim Cook. It seemed that while they had grown thin on bully beef, their general had grown fat on bœuf bourguignon. He had also grown fat off rank-and-file soldiers in a more direct way. In 1913, when Curry was trying to raise a new militia regiment in Victoria, he confronted many a property speculator's dilemma, which is impending bankruptcy. He had just overextended himself, invested in some dubious properties. You know, it happens. So, being Curry, trying to raise a new militia, having to pay a lot of bills, he diverted government funds intended for his troops into his own pocket to the tune of $10,833.34 to be precise. Curry's never prosecuted crime was an open secret in Ottawa. It was even discussed in cabinet. So Canada's greatest soldier stole money from his own men. At least, however, to move on to our third point, Curry can be said to have initiated the Canadian way of war. Well, not so fast. Recent scholarship points out how much Curry actually owed to the Europeans, and primarily to the French, who had first devised at Verdun many of the approaches later adopted at Vimy. And if the French supplied many of the ideas, British support in planning artillery, leadership, and fighting was instrumental to the battle. Many historians credit the Canadians' undoubted esprit de corps in April 1917 to that British blue blood, General Julian Byng, the man to whom Curry reported. It is a mistake, a fundamental mistake, in other words, to regard Vimy as a Canadian battle in either conception or execution. But there's even a more daunting challenge confronting the thesis of Canadian exceptionalism. The Canadian Expeditionary Force was, at the time of Vimy, demographically dominated by Britons. Even 6 months after Vimy, 55.48% of the Canadian Corps was foreign, i.e. born outside Canada. Offered a chance to serve in the military, most eligible Canadian-born men gave it a pass. And the evidence that Canadian soldiers evinced post-Vimy higher levels of Canadianism is also tenuous at best. Some of the French Canadians who were dramatically underrepresented at Vimy continued to express acute resentment against the Anglo-arrogance of their British Canadian counterparts, who would never warm to the notion of a bilingual Canada. Much of the weak evidence implying a new Vimy-induced Canadianism is in fact highly suspect. It comes from the 1960s and was often elicited in response to the enthusiastic prodding of nationalistic interviewers. So, you go up to your veteran and you say, "Would you agree, Fred, that you felt a new feeling of pride being a Canadian when you went up to Vimy Ridge?" And Fred would say, "Yeah, I guess so," and that's what got into the record. Really, it was a classic instance of oral historians prodding and producing exactly the kind of answers they were looking for at a time of high nationalism when everyone was trying to find things about Canada to celebrate, from the CPR to the fur trade. Moreover, throughout Vimyism, you find the questionable assumption that if some Canadians felt something in Europe that made them more Canadian, their sentiments were shared by most Canadians at home. But this is a highly problematic slippage. If indeed the Great War was in fact and generally seen to be Canada's War of Independence, one might have expected some echoes in the contemporary evidence that Canadians realized they had ever fought in such a war. But nobody used that language then, not even in the Diamond Jubilee celebrations of 1927. This supposed War of independence is in fact an invention of our own time. And consider the naivete of imagining that Canada earned its autonomy in the British Empire because of widespread gratitude for Vimy Ridge. This is not really how international power politics works. Empires are not scout troops handing out badges to their well-behaved and self-sacrificial members. In 1922, Lloyd George blithely assumed that Canada would fall into line when the British Empire contemplated its new war on Turkey. He seemingly had not got the memo about Canadian independence. In fact, Canada was in real terms less independent in 1921 than it had been in 1918. As Jack Granenstein usefully points out, to pay for the war, the country had become much more dependent on the Americans. And the argument that Vimy unified Canadians within Canada and provided a secure basis for pan-Canadian nationalism is even flimsier. In the wake of Vimy, and in part inspired by it, Prime Minister Robert Borden made the fateful decision to implement conscription in Canada. He then orchestrated an election marred by unprecedented levels of ethno-religious prejudice and hatred. So conscription means you're going to force people who don't want to join, if they're of the right age and the right gender, they'll still be compelled to join the military service. And this election in 1917 was over the top amazing in terms of the level of hatred projected against Catholics, against French Canadians, against people of color, against anybody who did not fit an archetypal definition of Canadianism. It was perhaps our ugliest election ever, and that's saying quite a lot. And consider what happens after the imposition of conscription. Canadian soldiers slaughtering their fellow citizens on Easter weekend in Quebec City in 1918 because those citizens had expressed their disagreement against the war, one of the bloodiest riots in Canadian history. What about the biggest claim of all, that this was a great war pitting good against evil, civilization against barbarism? The claim echoes, of course, the propaganda of the day. Symphony orchestras in North America moved to ban the playing of music by those barbarians, Bach and Beethoven. You even had debates in Canada about renaming the province of New Brunswick, because Brunswick has an ominously Germanic tinge. And you all know that Kitchener, Ontario, used to be known as Berlin, Ontario, when basically the city is coerced into changing its names by armed gangs of thugs. Can we seriously affirm this stark civilization-barbarism dichotomy today? Was the Entente, our side, solely in the right? Debate on that question has raged ever since 1914, generating entire libraries of contentious books. Still, it is fair to say that in 2015, only a very unusual historian would attribute 100% of the responsibility for the war to Germany. Such a verdict simply does not tally with a vast mountain of empirical evidence. And notice that in our zeal to make the 1914-1918 war basically all about Canada, and we're sort of using the war as our selfie, and we're sort of putting it up there and saying, oh, you know, we really are the center of the universe. The war is, we're telling it to ourselves like all about us. It's useful to remember that more African porters than Canadian soldiers died in the course of the Great War. And many of these porters died for a British Empire one is hesitant to deem a model of democracy. Was the Canadian way of war really morally superior to that of the enemy? The Canadian War Museum makes much of Canadian suffering from poison gas. And I think perhaps we can all agree, especially in Ian's course on morality, we can all agree that poisoning your enemy with doses of chlorine and phosgene is not one of the 20th century's more morally uplifting examples that we can take into the 21st. There's something kind of icky about poison gas warfare. It just sort of kills sneakily, it kills indiscriminately, it does not conform to anybody's idea of chivalry in warfare. Now, as it happens, the turn to chemical warfare was initiated by our side, the French, though it is undoubtedly the case that the Germans took this dark art to much, much deadlier levels, with some of them hoping and arguing that such a weapon would rapidly end the war, rather like the partisans of the atomic bomb in 1945. Pleased to be the pure of heart, peaceable, pleasant people of the planet, at least in our own minds, Canadians have yet to really acknowledge how enthusiastically we ourselves adopted chemical warfare. As Jack Granatstein put it in 2007, we used it because it worked. There is simply no doubt that it eased the way. Eased the way. There's a phrase that ought to be nominated for the award for military euphemism of all time. Death from the ingestion of our Canadian chemicals might take you as long as 18 hours, as the body discharged gallons of yellow pus and bile. It was an agonizing way to go. We dote on descriptions of Canadians suffering from this fate at the hands of the merciless Germans, but we avert our eyes from our own enthusiastic adoption of this same deadly weapon. And gas, of course, played a central role at Vimy Ridge. So when you're celebrating Vimy Ridge, you're also, in a way, celebrating chemical warfare. As Tim Cook puts it in a pungent phrase, Canadian soldiers were led, quote, like blind cattle mounting the slaughterhouse ramp, as they sought to move behind a toxic gaseous barrage at Vimy on the 1st of March 1917. Poison gas is a tricky weapon. If you ever attempted to use it, you need to sort of read the user's manual fairly carefully. Much of it depends on prevailing wind conditions. You really have to know how the gas is going to travel in the atmosphere. Many junior officers at Vimy tried to warn their senior brass, you know, this isn't a great scenario for the use of gas warfare. It's kind of hard to persuade the gas to go up a ridge. Everything just has to work perfectly. So the tactic they kept saying is not likely to work, and lo and behold, it didn't work. The gas went halfway up the ridge, then started to go right back down the ridge onto the Canadians who it was supposedly helping. The casualty rate among the Canadian attackers was 43%. One lieutenant termed the use of gas murder, not war. This is not war, it is simply murder, wrote another. You can no longer call it war, it is mere murdered, agreed a German of similar mind. This butchery is madness, adds another. I should not call this war, it is slaughter, wrote a desperate Canadian private. All these quotations drawn from Tim Cook's book. At Vimy, so overcome were the Germans themselves at the sight of the mountains of dead Canadians, killed by their own poison gas, that they compassionately arranged for an interval in the hostilities so the Canadians could collect their Vimy dead and bury them. Near Lens in 1917, the sun fell upon a battlefield overlaid with bloated corpses, forcing out odoriferous gases day and night that jerked soldiers to attention. Mounds of bodies were reduced to mounds of body parts as dead flesh was dismembered and churned up by the cascading shells. Echoes of Varley's For What and his landscape of hell. One Canadian captain wrote that if only some of those famous orators who shout, "Fight to the finish," could see this sight, they would pause and they would wonder whether they were in hell or whether they were living in the supposedly enlightened 20th century. I sense a further complication for Vance's civilization-barbarism dichotomy in the record of the Canadian treatment of prisoners. Canadians killed a lot of their German prisoners. It became a tradition, one that was well noticed by other nationalities involved in the war. From Ypres in 1915 to Vimy Ridge in 1917 to Amiens in 1918, accounts of Canadian prisoner killing abound. At Ypres, in one soldier's reminiscence, we had enough to do to take care of ourselves and our own wounded to bother about prisoners. In the Battle of Amiens, German bearing white flags were disregarded. And I quote, "When the garrison stepped out with raised hands, they were annihilated, almost to a man." And at Vimy Ridge, one soldier remembered, "Fritz lambasted us till we got right up to him. They threw their hands up and said, 'Mercy, comrade.' But I don't think they got much mercy." Perhaps the single most memorable reminiscence of Canadian prisoner killing in Cook's magnum opus comes from Courcelette in September 1916. From one dugout emerged a steady line of terrified, captive Germans. As they rounded a corner, each one of them was killed by the Canadians. And I quote, "One German tried to escape the slaughter by jumping out of the trench, dodging in and out amongst us to avoid being shot, crying out, 'Nine, 9!' He pulled out from his breast pocket a handful of photographs and tried to show them to us in an effort to gain our sympathy. As the bullets smacked into him, he fell to the ground motionless, the pathetic little photographs fluttering down to the earth around him." In addition to its willful avoidance of awkward facts, nationalistic narrowing of focus, insistent search for martial heroes, and stunning neglect of the Canadian minorities, he will never see this great war as their war of independence. There is a deep childishness to Vimy. Against all the evidence of the impersonality, cruelty, and massive scale of modern mechanized warfare, Vimyism wants us to imagine war as chivalry, as signaled by the Citizenship Guide's visual homage to the horse-mounted cavalry. Such horse-mounted charges were, in conditions of modern warfare, exceedingly gallant, but futile, to quote one contemporary soldier. Perhaps here we find the most serious trap of all, the trap of perpetual childhood. It demands of us that we forget we live under conditions of modernity, in which all that was solid has melted into air, including Victorian notions of individualism and heroism, clear-cut boundaries between civilians and soldiers, even firm distinctions between peace and war. Well after November the 11th, 1918, the Germans were deliberately starved, and perhaps as many as 1 million perished under the terms of our economic blockade. For some scholars, this was perhaps the most serious and consequential war crime of them all, because it so blatantly targeted innocent civilians. In so many official representations of the war today, we find a willful denial of a fact so apparent to those outraged soldiers of 1934 who rode into the Toronto Star. We find a denial of the fact that under conditions of modernity, war has changed. It has changed utterly and forever. And it is a fool's errand to try and recover its lost glamour. For look again at Varley's For What. In it, much that is solid, the lines between life and death, peace and war, our antique certainties have started to dissolve. Varley has used the form of a conventional pastoral landscape, a farmer in his field, to highlight how unconventional and how unpastoral was the world the Great War had ushered into being. This was a new normal, a brand new world, a terrifying new world. As Tim Cook writes near the conclusion of his work, the Great War for Civilization in fact destroyed the civilization that came before and created modernity in countless fields of human ideas, expression, and identity. From 1918 onwards, many Canadians, gazing with awe and dread upon this landscape of modernity, hoped against hope that they might never see it again.
So we do have time for some questions. Just remind you again, if you do have a question for Dr. McKay, if you just use the microphone over at the side there, that would be excellent, and we could hear you. Any takers?
Can you hear me? Oh, there we go.
Yeah, I can.
I just wanted to thank you for coming to Humber today and just give us this talk. And I'm glad to see that so many people came as well to listen to you. And my question is pretty simple. I just was wondering if you had an opinion on if Vimyism is connected to the Harper government's championing of the War of 1812, where they just obsessed over it on the 200-year anniversary, or the government's also obsession with finding those wrecked ships in the Arctic, which I don't even remember their names.
Yeah, I think that's a good question. It does start before the coming of Harper, and I wonder if the demise of Harper is really going to be the demise of Vimyism. But I think you're asking something really good about how essentially the past government really tried to change how we understand Canadian history. So you can see anticipations of that before the coming of Harper. But I think it greatly accelerated with the Harper government, and I think it's now maybe going to go through, maybe at least a change of key, if not, one might hope, a totally change of theme. The bill for the War of 1812 commemoration was about $33 million, and I've heard estimates for the Great War it's going to be in the neighborhood of $90 million. So it's not like they're not spending money on this, but it's really interesting, how people how Canadians have, in a sense, respected this message and yet resisted it. So poll after poll, the latest one I just saw last week from the Association of Canadian Studies, they said, what do you most admire about Canada? This is a scientifically conducted poll, and over 1,000 respondents. 2% said the wars. 10% said peacekeeping. 9% said Canada's a peaceful country. 8% said multiculturalism. So there's a way in which all of this push, this militarism, has somehow not quite found its target. I mean, remember the war in Afghanistan and how insistent the media were and everybody was that this was very much kind of a sacred crusade for Western civilization and for Canada. It was striking how after an initial burst of sort of support, the polls for that just kept going down and down and down and down and down. So I think, to go back to the lessons that people learned from the war, Fred Varley's lesson, I think Canadians sort of absorbed in their DNA the idea that war under conditions of modernity is slaughter. And every progressive step along this path has been one towards human extinction. And I think that's far from a minority standpoint in Canada.
Have a question?
So just going along with those disparities that we see, are there any initiatives to make changes in the education system over how we view war?
I think there's a lot of struggle in each classroom, in each school, about how wars are approached. My son is a school teacher in Whitby, and he says, so some teachers in his school would basically you do trench warfare half the year in your course, and the guys just love it because you get to sort of talk about guns and you build trenches, and you get all of this stuff from the government, free teaching materials. You get and would you rather sort of sit in a classroom and hear about the Canadian Constitution and federal provincial relations, or would you rather get into something rather more dramatic like the war? So his analysis is that half of the people who are teaching the Great War have this kind of rah-rah, Vimyist perspective, and the other half are trying to inject something critical into it. And the curriculum is so broad that you can kind of do either. So this is something to really watch if we're trying to change this channel. You know, the resources that have been poured into this narrative are enormous. The resources that are can construct a counter-narrative, who knows what they are. But there's certainly a lot, in the educational system, there are a lot of people sort of struggling with this issue almost every day.
Following along with that, there are a lot of resistance. Resistance to making changes then?
You'll find, especially a lecture like this, you know, it does enliven my email box. I have to say, you know, Professor McKay, you know, you have no right to say any of these things. And, you know, I try and be as empirically, factually based as I can, and also not rev it up and say things that I honestly don't think are true. But some people really feel that I have no right to say this. And yet, you know, I keep saying, well, these aren't my words. These are words actually coming from hundreds of veterans from 1934. So isn't your argument really with Fred Varley and these veterans and not with me? So I think it's a debate that has to be engaged carefully, factually, and with respect for, you know, I would also add with respect for people for whom war is still very deeply attractive. I mean, you know, look at video game culture. You know, I would submit that most people don't go back to their Xbox and work on intricate debates between two sides and how you can find a peaceful resolution. I suspect most shooter games are trying to get rid of those guys, you know, and blast as many, you know, hundreds of people as you can before breakfast. I mean, war is attractive. War is seductive. War is how generations of men, especially for millennia, have learned to measure their worth, their courage, their valor. And the tragedy for people who think that way is that there's almost going to be no realistic scope in a truly modern world for that perception. Because the next World War is not going to be fought valorously with people on horseback. It's going to be fought by people behind computer monitors pressing buttons, as they do with drone warfare today. So all the traditional virtues that we had associated with war, you know, go back to the Bible, or go back to Homer, or go back to any of the great myth symbol complexes that we nourish us. Go back to the Narnia books if you read those as kids. You know, war is a really big deal. War is how you get the narrative going. War is how you have a beginning and a middle and an end to the story. It's how we've defined ourselves as people for a long time. It's going to be awfully hard to get over that. And yet, as a culture, we kind of do. The most gripping projects facing the species, global climate change, for example. It's hard for me to understand how dropping bombs on changing climate is actually going to help things very much, right? And if you want to have an optimistic takeaway point, you know, look at it. Ernie Regeres just brought out a great book called Peace Building, and he points out that this is the first time in recent human history, like over 50 years, where you can find no record. This is when he was writing the book. It may have changed since then. You can find no states fighting war against other states. You can find wars being fought against quasi-state things and terrorist groups, but war as a solution of statecraft, which was kind of a normal thing, and then, you know, up to the First World War, really, you know, this is how you settled. If diplomacy fails, you send in your warriors, and you settle it that way, and the territory changes, and then things go back to normal. Slowly, I think, people are grasping that under conditions of modernity, that old 18th century model of war has vanished. It's no longer plausible. And that's why you're seeing the steady disappearance of war as an instrument of statecraft. And also, wars just don't work. I mean, the groups have done now statistical tabulations of, you know, interesting tabulations of the 99 wars that we've had since 1945, for example. How many actually resulted in outcomes that the people who start waging the war said they wanted to have? Almost none. So the practicality of modern warfare has essentially gone down the drain. It's kind of sad if you really dream of being a warrior. But maybe you need to then take those energies and that idealism, and that sense of being independent and self-propelling, and put it into a new field. where your courage and valor can be expressed in different ways.
Thank you.
Okay.
Hello. I was just wondering if the romanticization of the First World War, if you feel it had any links to feelings about the Second World War and the Cold War that immediately followed.
Yeah, I think especially with the Second World War, the coming of the Second World War, you can only appreciate how anguished that debate was. A Canadian populace that had moved massively against the war by 1934, then up against the reality of Hitler. What do we do? Do we just send him notes saying, we wish you were a nicer person? Which, Mackenzie King actually tried that. I think, myself, the Canadian response to the coming of the Second World War was right. I think it was the right war to fight. I also think Canadians were right to agonize over it, to think of any conceivable alternative that they might find to escape this tragic dilemma. So much of the Second World War was paved by the first, especially the mass starvation inflicted by the Allies after November the 11th. You imagine the toxicity that created in Germany. It's not that this directly caused the rise of Hitler, but it gave a demagogue like Hitler, an enormous amount of material to work with as he was basically paving the way for the Second World War. But the peace activists in Canada, the line about them, the sort of slanderous line, is peace activists equaled appeasers. Peace activists meant people who wanted to go easy on Hitler. The opposite is true for most of the Canadian peace movement. Peace activists wanted a League of Nations that would really enforce sanctions on dictatorships that were invading peaceful countries. They wanted the League of Nations as an international body to weigh in and stop those dictators from doing what they were doing. So it was a very different position than the one that's often attributed to them, which people say, well, they're just unrealistic or they were dreamers. These peace activists were extremely realistic. They were realistic enough to know this is what war looks like. And that fueled so much of their passion into the 1940s. And many of the ideas that were in the League of Nations, which, among, I would say, most historians now, they say the League of Nations and they kind of snicker, they're bad idea, complete waste of time, failure. Well, a lot of the institutions and ideas of the League of Nations flowed right into the United Nations. And actually, all those energies of the 30s were not lost. They were simply preserved in a new form in modern international diplomacy after the 1940s. So that was kind of those are the connections I would draw between this generation and the generation that fought the Second World War.
Do we have any other questions for Dr. McKay? All right. Well, if you think of one, I was going to invite everyone to linger if you are able. We have some light refreshments over at the side there. Maybe it's an opportunity to speak informally with Dr. McKay. I know he's sticking around for a bit. Thank you all for coming, and if you could join me once again, in thanking Dr. McKay for a very interesting lecture.